都被自己美貌震惊，经常忘记自己长什么样。
If you enjoy this video, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. How does Lacan's analysis of intersubjectivity relate to Hegel's master-slave dialectic? And 2. What is meant by the gap of being? Lacan begins this lecture summarizing the previous talk, focusing on the gaze and perversion. The two concepts are connected in that the gaze is revealed through perversion. In the example of sadism, the sadist sustains desire through the gaze of the one being tormented. This entire situation is a kind of limit experience that unfolds in the imaginary, but is implicitly structured by the symbolic. Lacan refers to the master-slave relation developed by Hegel to illustrate this. As such, it may be helpful, as we did with Sartre, to unpack this section in the Phenomenology of Spirit to better understand Lacan's thinking. In the section entitled Independent and Dependent Self-Consciousness, Lordship and Bondage, from the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel indicates that recognition is at the core of human desire, but recognition is always mediated through the other, who must be another subject rather than a mere object for us. I can only see myself in another who sees me as I see them. When I do, I gain the possibility of receiving their recognition that I desire. However, desire for Hegel consumes what it enjoys by making the thing of one's enjoyment entirely part of one's consciousness, kind of like assimilating food. If my desire was completed, I would then lose the other subject who recognizes me. We can see quite clearly at this moment the parallels to Lacan's discussion on perversion, which goes to the limit of recognition by sustaining desire in a precarious state of uncertainty between turning the other into an object and in recognizing the other as a subject. The sadist plays within that gap produced by the seesaw of desire within the specular relation. Now, how does this search for recognition transpire for Hegel? Well, first, at the beginning, we're a pure being for itself. We relate to ourselves in our immediacy, and here immediacy refers to a kind of undeveloped, elementary relation to life. It's a relation that delivers self-certainty, but not knowledge or truth. Mediation, by contrast, is a conceptualization, a reflection upon the things of the world. It brings two or more things together in a relation under a third thing, a concept that unifies the other two. My immediate relation to myself is an immersion within life before reflection, but upon becoming aware of another subject who is a subject like myself, self-consciousness is achieved in acquiring knowledge about myself through the other. We can think of the example of Sartre's Peeping Tom discussed in the last video as an example of this, and not coincidentally, since Sartre's analysis is heavily indebted to Hegel. So as such, consciousness must externalize itself in grasping the other as another subject, who in turn is doing the same. This interplay between two consciousnesses gives rise to the third term, this grasping the other as another subject, since Sartre's analysis is heavily indebted to Hegel. So as such, consciousness must externalize itself in grasping the other as another subject, who in turn is doing the same. This interplay between two consciousnesses gives rise to the third term, which is self-consciousness. Again, we see here parallels to how Lacan suggests the symbolic enters into the imaginary relation. To arrive at this self-consciousness, to move from it into the imaginary relation. To arrive at this self-consciousness, to move from a being for itself to a being for the other, requires risking our lives by entering a struggle to the death with the other. The risk here in seeking the death of the other is that the other becomes recognized as someone who may seek my own death as well. This is the first moment of realizing the subjectivity of the other. The threat of death awakens us from the immediacy of life as we now have to consider what the other is thinking so as to avoid the harm they may deliver. Lacan frames this struggle as a dialectic of the gaze, in which I imagine the other's detection of my intentions, where I'm going and so where I'm currently not. This then requires a kind of self-reflection about my own intentions as I now seek to disguise them from the other. In other words, I learn to lie. Doing this requires that I look at my thoughts through the eyes of the other. Without making the comparison too strongly, we see here something like a Hobbesian state of nature, a kind of war of all against all. But the comparison is not completely accurate, since though engraved in this struggle, what I truly desire is recognition. If I kill the other, I would gain a fleeting moment of satisfaction, but when I annihilate the other, I also lose the possibility of gaining recognition from them. As such, the next best option is to get the upper hand and turn the other into a slave and require them to set aside their being for itself and exist solely for the master. This is what establishes the master-slave relation. It's also the position of the dominant in relation to the submissive. The master exists only for itself, whereas the slave is compelled to be for the other, the master. Slaves are put in relation to things that they must mediate for the master, who can then enjoy them. The way Lacan puts this is that the master or styled master is what establishes their being for itself and exists solely for the master. This is what establishes the master-slave relation. It's also the position of the dominant in relation to the submissive. The master exists only for itself, whereas the slave is compelled to be for the other, the master. Slaves are put in relation to things that they must mediate for the master, who can then enjoy them. The way Lacan puts this is that the master establishes their superiority in the dual relation. This imaginary relation then opens the possibility for the law to be imposed upon the slave, requiring that they engage in labor for the jouissance of the master. Again, if we return to the example of sadism, we can think of the dominant and the submissive is not purely in an objective relationship, but there are rules. There's the safety word, so to speak, that actually governs the entire relation. After reading this lecture, I've been thinking someone should write an essay, do a video on the Lacanian way of looking at the 50 Shades of Grey series. I'm not sure if I'll do that one day, but just a thought for anyone out there. The difficulty in this arrangement is that the master cannot get any genuine recognition from the slave, as that would require the other be an independent self-consciousness, and the master can't allow for the slave to become that. So the truth of the master remains located in the slave, which the master can't gain access to, and the slave, at least at first, has no consciousness of possessing. Now, Hegel will go on in this section to describe how the slave who possesses this truth may achieve his own independent self-consciousness, but I think for the purpose of this lecture of Lacan today, we've covered some of the important points, and I'm sure we'll return to this again in the future. So let us move now to the second question for today. What is the gap of being? After a discussion on balanced understanding of transference, Lacan addresses the function of speech, noting that it always has an ambiguous backdrop, a place which is beyond speech, and so ineffable. This beyond of speech is within the very dimension of speech itself, as what is hollowed out in the experience of speech. This hollowed out dimension of speech is called the gap of experience within the very beyond speech. That it opens understanding of transference, Lacan addresses the function of speech, noting that it always has an ambiguous backdrop, a place which is beyond speech and so ineffable. This beyond of speech is within the very dimension of speech itself, as what is hollowed out in the experience of speech. This hollowed out dimension of speech is called the gap of being. It's where in analytic experience one locates the subject. Lacan will later on describe this introduction of the symbolic as a cut in the real. Now,
A cut in the real， 你们知道是什么感觉吗？我不知道你们有没有这个感觉，这个我经常有，就是对我来说比较那个时刻还蛮特殊的，经常在一个条件下被触发，就是就是陌生的居民楼，我也不知道为什么，你有这种感觉吗？虽然他也不知道我在说什么，就是 每次我去到一个就比较陌生的城市或者什么地方，然后我看到那地方那种居民楼那种比较老旧的，但是它是跟我小时候生活的那个居民楼有一些类似的那种场景，然后特别是傍晚的时候，然后开始有几户那个人家灯光的时候，然后那种感觉就来了。你们知道我在说什么吗？熟悉的天花板，不是那种熟悉的感觉，我说不上。这个说不上的感觉就是他说的这个东西，就是说象征切割了实在，然后切割之后呢，你有一个 gap of being， 就是那个东西就是 gap of being， 就是说主体是什么？主体是完全你不能完全说出来那个东西嘛，就是总是说不出来那个剩余嘛。你们现在能理解吗？不是曾经见到过，是说一种言说不了的感觉，不是说你们能说出来的，你们还是没明白，是说不出来，就是它有一种很强烈的东西，但是说不出来，不知道用任何的语言去表达它，就掏空了语言的东西。那个东西其实就是在分析中遭遇主体的时刻了，因为主体不可能完全是被言说出来的嘛，对吧？就它始终有个东西，有个剩余是言说不了的。就这个东西，就是我们昨天不是讲了这个，就是说在场与不在场，存在与非存在的辩证法嘛。其实这个在语言中也是同样如此，语言中需要这个中空的部分变成 the gap of being， 才能建立起主体性。对，就是有种特别的感觉，描述不了。不是说它又高耸了，反正就是说不出来。你可以描述它，比如说它高耸冷峻，但是还不够。它同时比如说又可能亲切熟悉，但是还不够。它同时会给人一种就是疏离的寂寞感，但同时又会感觉怎么样？就是你不管怎么样，你也说不出来那个东西。这个其实就是 gap of being， 因为它就是整个实在的东西被这个象征秩序所切割。因为我在跟你们讨论这些问题的时候都是象征嘛，像你说比如说什么熟悉、陌生，什么家的感觉，然后什么他者的那种凝视的什么危险的感觉。就是种种这些东西，他都说不出来，不是说不出来，就是不管怎么说，还是有一个这个 ambiguities， 就是有个这个模糊性讲不出来。
Now, with this in mind, let's move a few pages backwards, where on 228, Lacan notes that the start of the analytic experience involved mendacious speech, or speech that lies. Lacan states that, in fact, speech makes lying possible because speech makes possible judgments of truth and falsity by introducing what is and what is not. This is not to deny that there's some underlying reality, something hard and durable that's there before language, but things don't exist for us until they are brought into speech, that is, until they're mediated. This is a strange notion to get our minds wrapped around, since we typically consider existence as a kind of precondition for everything else. This is where we have to keep in mind the Hegelian influence and the distinction between immediacy and mediation. Mediation, which in this case is speech, allows for truth. Prior to this, we lack the reflective consciousness necessary to know things, and so lack access to the truth. For Lacan, this nothing, this before being, is the real. Now this raises some questions that we won't get any answers to today, and will have to be things we'll return to in the future. For example, if the real is prior to being, how does it function, if at all? We'll later see how the real, though it does not possess being, still exists, meaning that there remains a kind of pushing out into and through being that itself does not possess being, a kind of radical otherness at the center of ourselves. And we'll certainly elaborate upon this idea over time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll next move into the final section of Seminar 1 entitled Speech in the Transference. I look forward to seeing your invisible gazes then.
所以前期就是研讨班1跟2，拉康对这个实在讨论的，比较初步啊，他后面会讲得很好。
Emotion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video is on lecture 19 in Seminar 1, entitled The Creative Function of Speech. If you enjoy this video, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. In this video, I asked the following questions. 1. What is speech? 2. What does it mean for the concept to be the time of the thing? And 3. What is transference in light of the understanding of speech presented here? In this lecture, Lacan distinguishes between speech and the sounds made by animals, whose activity may be in many circumstances, a mechanical movement. Speech, in contrast, seeks to gain recognition. One aims to have it understood as speech and for it to be believed. So
这里就是讲言说跟动物的语言嘛，其实他研讨班2后面讲了一大段，就是关于这个言说跟语言的区别了。然后他有问就在场那些语言学者一个问题，就是说他说一段话，说在这里面它到底是语言还是言说，是 language 还是 speech。然后那一大段那个例子什么我忘记了，好像是说好像说几个拉比在讨论一个什么星球，不是星球另外一个，为什么星球不说话？讨论一个问题，就是什么，反正到时候看研讨班2时候再说吧。然后就那一段，然后他问那几个语言学的学者，什么这个博士那个博士，就说这一段话到底是语言还是言说。
Uniquely distinguishes itself from other sounds in that it requires the other. He offers the example of Odysseus's men, who in Book 10 of the Odyssey are turned into swine by the sorceress Kirke. These men now reside in an ambiguous space between human and animal as their grunts continue to seek recognition. In this case, they're an expression of nostalgia for Odysseus and the relation.
但是总之他的回答是非常禅师的，也不叫非常禅师吧，就很精神分析的时刻，能明白吗？就是比如说他问别人为什么行星不说话，他们在场的一些人为什么行星不说话，就为什么行星 doesn't speak the planets 就是为什么不说话，然后有人就开玩笑回答嘛，就说因为他没有嘴。然后他们说对，这个就说这个答案我们听起来会 disappointed 很失望，对不对？但是这个他是失望，就因为这个是失望，所以这个也许是一个正确的答案。就是这里你们能明白为什么就是分析师的时刻吗？就是他从这个问题。就是问题跟答案，然后到我们期待获得什么样的答案，对吧？就为什么我们会感到失望，就这个是问题所在。就是行星为什么不说话，这个问题的答案并不是说它具体有一个什么答案，因为这个问题它也不会有什么答案。但是问题是我们听到这个答案，就是说行星为什么不说话，我们听到这个答案会感到失望。就这个是他认为需要回答的问题，所以这就是分析师的时刻。
And they had with him when still human. A second element of speech, beyond its aim for recognition, is that it's inherently polysemous. Speech never has just one meaning or signification. Instead, the meaning of speech is the totality of its uses. Now here one might be led to think of the later Wittgenstein and his work, The Philosophical Investigations, in which he says something quite similar. However, for Wittgenstein, the use of words are found in situated meanings held together in specific language games, and not based in the history of the subject as it is for Lacan. The use of speech takes on meanings that can often deviate from the kind of communal practices Wittgenstein seems to have in mind. One way to think of this difference is in terms of the creative function of speech, in which present words take on significations that find their origin in the past. This is the metaphorical character of speech, which Lacan understands as not primarily about making comparisons, but in creating a new order of being and linking the meanings of the unspoken past to the meanings of presently spoken words, drawing connections in ways that are not necessarily obvious. The creative function of speech is to deploy metaphor to create resonances among these meanings. The multiplicity of meanings all point toward a beyond of speech.
其实啊，你们就是对什么移情这个东西还有点懵逼，对不对？其实移情包括这里他说的言说，还有他讲那个，其实他上一讲黑格尔那个主动辩证法不是已经讲得非常明确了吗？就关于那个什么受虐狂、凝视、移情这些东西，就是你们明白吗？就是说精神分析你学到最后，它所有的概念都只是一个过程。它这里其实就是说，就是主体是如何通过这个能指系统的异化获得那种误认的，就是它这一系列名词就是那一个过程。 就从什么乱七八糟，其实它本质上就是黑格尔讲那个主奴辩证法。脏妈是不是就是一种移情？是，但是也不能说是不是就是一种移情，这个问法就有问题，因为大部分就主体跟客体的关系都是移情关系。他上一讲其实已经讲得很明白了，我不知道你们能不能理解。如果你们能理解，你们这一大段你们就都能懂了，就是它那些名词到底啥意思，就那个过程到底是什么。它包括这一章讲物的时间，其实也是讲这个移情的问题了。应该说任何的主体跟客体关系都是移情了，因为你想想看嘛，虽然你们长得很丑，也没什么身材，但是我觉得就是你们不能体会就是长得好看的人是什么心情。就是我这种长得漂亮的人，你知道每天我们都在想什么吗？每天我都在想，哎，我长得这么漂亮，我一定要听别人说我漂亮，不然我白长这么漂亮了。就赞美是就是说赞美怎么听也是听不够的。而且事实上就是如果别人不说我长得漂亮，我是不知道自己长什么样的，我是不知道自己长得漂亮的。然后我只是说这个感受是比较直观的，但其实你们能明白这里吗？就是说主体它这个就是希望自己成为主体，它需要客体的承认，对吧？但是它需要另外一个主体的承认。所以我只能把你们当成人啊，因为我不把你们当成人的话，你们说我漂亮这个事儿有用吗？我照镜子就是镜像嘛。但是这个漂亮，因为它又是属于叫那个什么，就是主人能指，就是漂亮这东西就是一种这个权力关系。这里不是主体坚信啊，这在我看就是能指坚信。你这个欲望的跷跷板是从这时候开始的嘛？这就是他前面讲欲望的跷跷板 seesaw， 对不对？就是我必须得我自己看我自己漂亮，这没有用。我跟一个客体是不行，没有用。我必须跟另外一个主体，这个主体就是你必须，但是我就是先必须将你们承认为主体才可以，对吧？如果我将你们承认为主体的话，我就会一直在想我在你们眼里是什么样，对不对？就重点不是说，就是说。比如说我为什么穿成这个样子，就白白的，就是这种少女的感觉，是因为我希望在你们心里我是清纯的少女的那种纯洁的美、纯欲的美，这种白白的、粉粉的。就是说，如果没有这种主体间的就镜像关系的话，比如说这个白白的、粉粉的象征着什么？其实它也不象征着什么，它只是要象征的，它必须得变成这种东西。所以说，这个欲望的跷跷板，这个 seesaw 就是这样开始的。但这样开始就是说。我必须也将你们承认为这个主体，因为我希望得到你们的认可，对吧？但是呢，我们的关系肯定是一种不平等的关系嘛。因为当我希望你们称赞我漂亮的时候，其实是我要享用你们的劳动带来的享乐嘛。但是这里面又不太一样，这是另外一个话题，因为这个是涉及到这个女人作为客体被交换带来的这个剩余元乐的另外一个话题啊。所以说这里就是一种女性性的享乐，就是说我希望就是 hysteria 式的，对吧？就它不是 obsession 是我需要你崇拜我，我需要你就是承认我是主人，但是我这个 hysteria 是我希望你欲望我，它是两种，就是第二种就是一种议政式的女性式的嘛。然后总之就是这个移情你们知道吗？就是你们现在到底明白什么是移情？我讲了这么半天就想讲这个事情。移情就是你将另外一个客体承认为主体，然后你从他的那个视角回来凝视你自己的这样一个过程，其实就是移情。因为你总是从就是对面的那个角度来看你自己，但本质上就是一种自恋嘛，对吧？所以你的就是主体坚信，这种坚信本质上是一种自恋，因为你总是说。你比如说我跟你们说我现在这个样子，就我是幻想我在你们眼里是什么样，对不对？我希望你们来欲望我什么什么之类的。所以这个主体间的关系，这种移情的关系都是一种自恋式的关系，其实这就是移情的意思。移情的意思其实就是我跟你们的关系本质上还是我跟我自己的关系，因为这种我在你们眼里的样子就是我的理想自我嘛，我的理想自我其实就是 the other 嘛，就是大他者嘛，就本质还是你在大他者凝视下你表现出什么样子嘛。所以他讲了这一大堆什么什么主客体，什么物的时间，什么移情，什么什么这些东西都是同一个，都是一个这样回来的那种凝视的那种东西。所以我就跟你们说，它这个概念其实就是这样的一个过程，只不过是它每个过程它是让你理解，就找了一个名词儿，然后说这个是什么，那个是什么。然后这个东西比如说移情，我这么跟你说好了，你对自己的那个你认为别人怎么想你的那个东西跟事实上别人怎么想你但是根本也不存在事实上别人怎么想你这个东西啊，因为这一切都在变，对不对？ 比如说你觉得你在那个，比如说我一直觉得周日很喜欢我，就这种移情的现象，其实在现实里不是经常发生吗？就你老觉得别人喜欢你什么的，对吧？或者是你觉得，就是你为什么老觉得别人喜欢你呢？因为其实是你喜欢你自己嘛，对吧？比如说别人看了一眼，就哎，我老觉得他喜欢我，我觉得这个人喜欢我，我也觉得那个人喜欢我，因为你看到你自己样子，就是你幻想你自己在他那个眼里面样子嘛，其实就是你喜欢你自己，简单来说。所以就这个东西就全是移情。那么移情的危险在于什么呢？移情的危险就在于它让你看不清主体跟客体之间的关系，主体跟他者之间的关系，因为一切都是你跟你自己的关系嘛。所以说这就导致就是说在这个生活中呢，竟然经常被暴击。比如说你是不是有这种感觉，就是说你本来觉得这个人对你印象很好，后来你发现其实他对你印象不好，然后你一下就对他产生了恨意，就开始负向移情。你现在也懂什么叫负向移情了吧？因为你本来是自恋的，你觉得比如说那个男生，你就觉得他一个女生好了，你就觉得那个女生一直很欣赏你的，比如说，对你觉得自己是别人觉得你是犯病，但你觉得自己是幽默，你觉得那个女生就是特别欣赏你的幽默，后来你发现她觉得你就是个鲁蛇，又穷鬼、臭屌丝、死舔狗，然后你就会加倍恨她，因为你本来觉得她喜欢你，你知道吗？
Metaphor brings us to this ineffable limit. This beyond the speech and ineffable limit is the thing that makes the metaphor possible in the first place. The concept brings the thing into being. Lacan has a specific understanding of concept here, which he explicitly links to Hegel. In The Science of Logic, Hegel states that the distinction between thought and reality is overcome by the concept. It is what allows thought to think itself, and thus is integral for self-consciousness. The concept is thought teleologically as a process of self-differentiation, aiming at absolute spirit, and unfolding in a series of dialectical stages. Lacan, drawing on this temporal notion of the concept, states that the concept is the time of the thing. Think.
比如说我们这里分析一下前两天看过那个，就那个中年鲁社，然后回家跟他什么继母吵起来的那个事情。因为你想想看，他管那个女人叫继母，就是事实上呢可以称呼很多，比如继母这个词儿其实是我们不太会用的词儿，对吧？就一般人不会管这个东西叫继母或者什么的。然后他就说他跟那个女人吵起来了，因为那个女人说他没有眼力劲儿，就是他们彼此之间的双向的负向移情嘛。就是他本来是觉得这个继母肯定是喜欢他的，对吧？肯定是觉得他特别好，特别优秀，肯定觉得他精壮男子，对不对？这么有思想，这么深邃。然后结果被人说了一嘴，说真是没眼力劲儿啊，然后他一下就崩溃了，他就开始疯狂的厌恶他。他为自己喜欢他而厌恶他，而厌恶自己，就是负向移情。但是同时，那个女性对他的负向移情也是就是双向的，所以你们就明白为什么就他那种厌恶感从何而来？因为大部分人就是，比如说，如果你不存在这种就是负移情的话，或者是什么这种现象的话，比如说那个阿姨会说一句，就说。那是这么眼里这样，哎，算了，跟他一般见识。就因为你不在乎这个人，就这个人说什么就真的无所谓，对吧？就好像这么说好了，但凡是那些东西你在乎，你就是移情，要么就是说正向，要么是负向的，对吧？就正向跟负向其实同一个东西了，它只不过是这个评价的问题。但是移情已然发生了，已然发生就是你会用对方，就是你就是会。就是幻想那个在对方眼中那个凝视的点。
Things had no realization before speech. Speech, through the concept, brings them into being. In other words, it gives them a beginning. So the thing is where the concept is, and yet where it's not. It's always an identity in difference. Here we find some resonances with Deleuze, where he states, an entire multiplicity rumbles underneath the sameness of the idea. The thing saturates the concept, but this excess also means that the concept can never fully express the thing. The creative function of speech through metaphor gives...
对啊，移情是来自想象界的，因为移情跟 meaning 没有什么关系嘛，移情跟意义没有什么关系啊，它就是纯一个自恋性的。更重要的是它是来自于想象，来自于关于跟身体有关的点。这个东西我们之前不是也经常说嘛，就是人是完全不知道自己长什么样子的。你看到了自己那种整体的影像，就比如说在那个什么穿衣镜，什么大的那个就是某种光学平面上看到那些东西，首先它也是经过光学反射的，对吧？ 就是他也拍平了。这个我们不是经常说这个事情吗？就是说你想看到自己长什么样子，你除非把你眼珠都抠出来，然后看自己，然后你还得把自己眼睛填上，不然你是永远看不到自己长什么样子的。就是你对自己身体的那种东西纯粹是一个想象性的，那么你就幻想自己什么样的，就是借助另外一双眼睛嘛，就是从别人的那里去幻想凝视自己嘛。所以说这种移情都属于想象性的。而且这个例子我经常跟你们讲，就是事实上你们就是不知道可以给自己建模不行，那还是通过就跟眼睛直接看还是不一样，因为那也是个2D 平面，因为你不管怎么看它都已经是2D 平面了就是经过某种光学装置的反射了。而且你对自己的就各个身体那些东西的评价其实是不准确的。比如说我从小到大一直觉得我头很大，我就还经常为这个事情自卑，就觉得我自己身材比例特别不好，头很大，然后别人每次就经常会说我不止脸长得漂亮，身材也是绝。然后我每次就觉得别人就是过分夸赞我，然后我就说也没有那么绝吧，也没有那么好吧。但是后来我是很后面才知道，我都30多岁了，我才知道原来我头很小，就原来我头很小，我比例很好。为什么别人老觉得我特别高？其实就是因为我头小。但是我30多年从来不知道自己头小这个事情，所以我就跟你说，事实上你对自己的身体有统一的那种东西，全部都是一个基于想象性的。因为事实上你连自己头大头小都不知道。
只有我和当年的你觉得你头大。
对，所以那时候我头大，我就觉得很可怕。我想说，难道我真的是头大吗？就是我关于我自己，我觉得自己头很小，其实是个幻觉嘛。后来我跟很多人求证，发现啊，并不大，感觉头不小。那是因为直播，我这个直播是那什么，就是这样倒着的，就是说它有个角度。事实上，你看，你就能看出来，其实头很小。你把头得绑起来，你会觉得头更小。我就是跟你们说，你对身体的这种，就是说。那个自己身体什么样那种认识全部都是想象性的，你事实上没有那么清楚的把握这个事情的。而且身体就是一个能指，身体是一个言说的能指 a speech signifier。 我也是就是经历了这个就是矫正，我才能想明白这个问题。所以建议大家可以多关注一下自己的身体。其实
The thing is motion in history as it finds expression in different concepts. The notion of motion is important here because time is motion. The passing of time is not essentially what's measured.
Fairless 还是比较能客观把握的，更不能了。Fairless 怎么客观把握呀？你能客观把握的只是它的那个，比如说你觉得尺寸，但是尺寸并不重要啊，因为还有硬度还有时间，速度、姿势这些东西都不能把握它。而且就算这些东西都对了，然后也不一定体验就好。因为比如说你可能脸很丑，或者是这个肚子很大，对气味也有关系啊。还有你们的那个，就这些东西都还挺那什么的，挺重要的。比如说你对对对方的态度，对不对？或者你对这个事情的态度是什么？其实都还蛮重要的，就是也客观把握不了的事儿。就以后不要说客观这个词儿，说实话，你们没有发现学哲学学了这么长时间，就这两个词儿，我好像从来没有说过理性跟客观这两个词儿。你们看那些谁什么理性客观，然后就黑格尔可能会说，其实很少会说这两个词儿。
On a clock, but it's the encounter with change. As such, Lacan states that this allows us to understand Heraclitus' notion of the flux and that famous expression that you cannot step in the same river twice. Here the river is the thing, and the stepping in the river is the concept. Another way of saying this is that speech always has a diachronic dimension and is not merely synchronic. Diachrony is the change of meaning of words over time. And this is where Lacan differs from Saussure of words over time. And this is where Lacan differs from Saussure's linguistics. Saussure was concerned with how different signifiers.
然后后来这个德里达把拉康也反驳了，不是说历史性，是它本身就演绎，它不需要历史。
Simultaneously function in relation to each other within a system of language. Lacan brings Saussure's linguistics into conversation with the Hegelian notion of dialectical history. So what does this mean for the unconscious? In his work, The Ego and the Id, Freud states that in the id, there is nothing corresponding to the idea of time, no recognition of the passage of time, and no alteration of mental processes by the passage of time. If we recall from a previous video, Lacan appears to equate the id with the subject. The unconscious is like the concept, which is not in time, but creates time. It's time itself. Now, it's not entirely clear to me, but creates time. It's time itself. Now, it's not entirely clear to me, based on this lecture alone, how this is the case when concepts shift over time, and so would it not mean that the unconscious is in some way in motion? And so while it gives time to the thing, it's also in time to the degree the subject can be repositioned vis-a-vis the thing through new concepts. I'm making an assumption here that the unconscious is linguistic rather than it being equated with the thing here, because the thing itself doesn't have time until it enters into the concept. So it depends on what Lacan means here, and I guess we'll have to kind of continue to unpack this. What this does provide some insight into, however, is when Lacan will later say in Seminar 11, the true formula of atheism is not God is dead, but God is unconscious. This is explicitly in reference to the way the murdered father continues to function in the unconscious. So we don't want to overinterpret this too much, but we know that Lacan was also well read in Augustine, something that will be made evident as we enter into the lecture. And for Augustine, God is both outside of time and creates time. Yet this similarly poses another difficulty, as it does for the concept of the unconscious, which is if God interacts with creation and thus is in some sense has motion, how is it possible for God to be outside of time? Let us take up the final question for today. What is transference in light of this understanding of speech? When it concerns the beyond of speech within psychoanalysis, we are in fact addressing repressed desire. The repressed is what is forbidden to direct expression by our modes of discourse, and thus what cannot be recognized. Nonetheless, discourse, though not being able to be expressed directly, does participate in something concerning the ineffable repressed thing. Lacan deploys the term interlineation to describe this participation. Interlineation is commonly used as a legal term to describe the insertion of new language into previously written language, such as one would find in a contract. It's a sort of an amendment to the text. And it's in this manner we can understand how repressed desire may be expressed. This also helps us to understand the nature of transference. Lacan here then refers to Freud, who, he points out, first addressed the concept of transference in The Interpretation of Dreams. There, it's in reference to what Freud calls day residues, which are memory traces left over from events and experiences that happen while awake. They're used as the raw material through which desires may be expressed in dreams. These leftovers are emptied of their meaning and divested of their desire that they may have had in waking life, becoming kind of like empty containers that can now be appropriated for other purposes. Phonemes can often function in this way once they've been detached from meanings associated with them in their original semantic context. They are then, through a process of interlineation, taken up again by being given another meaning. And this is what Freud calls transference. In conclusion, we can now understand something more concerning the analysis of transference, which seeks out the multiple meanings of speech. It draws connections to the respective situations, and it does this by paying attention to when speech is full. Previously in Lecture 4, Lacan noted that full speech is spoken through deformation and moments of failure, through the slips, holds, and repetitions. It's where the forbidden, unsayable, repressed desire becomes said in some fashion. And so, we may say that the creative function of speech is, in its mistakes, more so than in any clarity of insight typically thought to be attributed to what is considered a good metaphor. Thank you for watching. I look forward to being with you again, though differently, next time.
好，鼓掌，感谢拉黑字幕组，已经把这个研讨班一总结的很好了。其实这个人讲的很多东西是来自于另外一本书，这本书呢更简单，就是来自于你们的老朋友 Bruce Fink。这个书是一些学者写的，对于这个研讨班1跟2的文章，就也是评论，就也是解释拉康。其实有几篇是那个安兰米勒自己写的，还有几篇是 Bruce Fink 还有一些其他的学者写的。Bruce Fink 写的就是那个我们今天看的那期关于一封失窃的信的。你看，比如说这个是安兰米勒自己写的，然后这个是安兰米勒，这是安兰米勒，然后还有这个 Class Solar， 这个也是那谁的徒弟，拉康的徒弟还是安兰米勒的徒弟，这个人也蛮有名的，对吧 ？Class Solar。然后还有就是 Bruce Fink 写的，然后还有这个人，这个人蛮有名的，反正就是拉康徒子徒孙写的吧，就是关于这个研讨班1跟2的解释。就这个怎么说呢？就这个人讲的很多东西也是从这里面来的了，就是大家秀一下自己对这个拉康的理解，就讲的会比拉康原文讲的简单。其实拉康原文讲的也并不难，我觉得主要是拉康的说法就是那种说法，所以反正 anyway， 如果有兴趣可以看一下这本书啊，英文的研讨班，我觉得其实也可以翻一下，因为他们现在搞研讨班3嘛，我觉得可以抽空搞一下。反正1跟2就是一些基本的概念介绍，像我刚才讲一些什么移情什么之类的。怎么说呢？反正就是要想打好基础，就是这些都要听；要不想打好基础，你直接看后面也可以。我们再学一期吗？2吗？学一期吗？哪有资源？我发给助教，你去群里找。你们哪有资源你也不会看，问题是哪有资源？这时候装好学了，哪有资源呀？那研讨班1跟2你看了吗？那资源都有，也没见你看，哪有资源？来吧，再学一期，这是第2期。
Series dedicated seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today is on lectures 1 and 2 and seminar 2. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. Who is the ego? 2. What was Freud's major discovery according to Lacan? And 3. What is the difference between symbolic time and imaginary time? If you learned something from this video, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. Question 1. Who is the ego? Lacan begins by declaring that Seminar 2 will focus on the concept of the ego in Freud's theory, examining and considering criticisms of it. Lacan also plans to connect this concept to psychoanalytic technique as well as to what Lacan calls Freud's major discovery, which we'll identify later. The lack of success and inevitable resistance that he encountered in his analysis led him to propose a new metapsychological model that included not only the ego, but also the id and superego. Lacan indicates we will examine texts from this period, including Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Group Psychology, and the Analysis of the Ego, as well as the ego and the id. So what or who exactly is this ego? It's a notion that has links with its philosophical counterpart. That philosophical ego is generally associated with the emergence of early modern thought, beginning with René Descartes, who, as the standard telling goes, grounds knowledge upon an indubitable foundation of thought that delivers a kind of certainty that I exist, the famous cogito ergo sum. Upon this rock, Descartes can reclaim the certainty of mathematics.
cogito 说到这个东西就想笑，因为大部分人的哲学水平其实就是甚至不到笛卡尔，对不对？比如说这个我思故我在，好像是小时候写作文什么的最喜欢引用的一句话，动不动什么东西就引用我思故我在，然后是那种就是最庸俗的常识意义上理解的，甚至不是笛卡尔说的那个意义上的。因为就算你理解笛卡尔说的那个，笛卡尔说的也是错的呀。因为哲学就是不断的要把一些就是你没有经过任何反思就接受下来的东西来提问嘛，对吧？问出这个问题，我思故我在，就那个东西为什么它就是我呢？没有人问过这个问题，对吧
？This cogito, the I think, comes to be an early iteration of the modern philosophical ego, and its principal characteristic is that it is what grounds knowledge in itself. Now, I say this is a standard telling because some analyses have demonstrated that Descartes' own thought may not, because what grounds now a philosophical ego, and its principal characteristic is that it is what grounds knowledge in itself. Now, I say this is a standard telling because some analyses have demonstrated that Descartes' own thought may not fit so neatly within what has come to be called Cartesianism, despite it bearing his name. The ego continues to be refined in the early modern period, giving rise to what philosopher Charles Taylor has named the punctual self. Such a self is characterized by a kind of radical reflexivity that allows the mind to look at its own self, including its reasoning, will, and desires, as if from an extrinsic perspective. It is an abstraction of oneself whose power lies in the ability to fix things as objects. This mention of objects is important in relation to the ego. An object within this philosophical context is what can be objectified, rendered thoroughly observable, and defined by a set of properties or attributes. Central to the ego is its capacity to reduce things to objects, rendering them knowable, predictable, and capable of manipulation. This orientation has major ramifications not only for philosophy, but also for economics in the case of capitalism, which is founded upon the standardization and mass reproduction of objects, as well as science, which requires that things conform to operational definitions and thus be made objectifiable. You perhaps can already sense resonances here with Lacan's register of the imaginary and the characteristics of the ego that functions within it. Question 2, what was Freud's major discovery? In lecture 10 of seminar 1, Lacan states that the Freudian discovery was connecting the libido with neurosis and seeing neuroses as an indirect manner of satisfying the libido. Now in seminar 2, Lacan offers another formulation of what he considers Freud's major discovery. In setting out to subvert this ego, Freud shows how the I is another, according to Lacan. Je est un autre. This I is not identified with the ego, individuality, or consciousness. But what does this mean? Who is the other? First, it's a subject, which already puts it at odds with the transcendental ego, the philosophical ego, which is an abstraction devoid of much subjectivity except for its self-transparent consciousness. Rather, this subject, who is an other, holds a decentered relation to consciousness, operating as an unconscious that eludes the certainties delivered by the ego. Though, as we saw in the previous seminar, there are elements of the ego that are also unconscious, and what's not entirely clear still to me is whether this makes up part of what Lacan calls the subject, or whether the subject makes up only part of what he calls the unconscious. It also raises a question as to where one may locate consciousness, since it's not fully equated with the ego. Lacan states that consciousness is what is transparent to itself, whereas the I, the subject, is not. Consciousness is also unlocalizable. A major emphasis in the first seminar was the degradation of Freud's theory in what followed him. These ego psychologists saw Freud as bringing back the ego, and thus theorizing began to focus on how the ego must be strengthened. For Lacan, this is a deeply problematic development, as it amounts to a complicity between analysis and the illusions of our experience. In other words, it reinforces the problematic imaginary identifications that, as Lacan showed in the previous seminar, is the source of the analysis.
就是在那个研讨班2上面，就讲了这个弗洛伊德这个 ego 这个话题时候，他就痛喷了一通那个后面那些逼，包括那个弗洛伊德的女儿，就是因为那些人的流派现在全部叫做 ego psychology 嘛，就是自我心理学，他们还是那种就是最传统的思路嘛，就是说 ego 自我，然后自我不堪重负，因为它是一个就是超我压抑了本我的欲望，然后在这种压抑中产生了症状，然后自我就承担这个功能，然后当发生症状的时候，就是自我它对这个功能出现障碍、出现问题了，所以我们要调整这个自我的功能，重新达到某种就是超我跟这个本我之间的平衡。就是差不多，就是你这个东西其实现在荣格比这个还强一点，荣格比这个还强一点了，但是那个就是大部分人就是 一些什么什么自我心理学，就都是这些东西，那些就受不了了，让他就受不了了。
Sam's problematic relationship with itself. Question number 3. What is the difference between symbolic time?
因为其实晚期也不叫晚期了，就弗洛伊德后来的一些书籍，他已经提出这个问题了嘛，就文明极其不满嘛。所以说，这个弗洛伊德真的是很天才，文明极其不满就这个意思，就是他就提出了升华嘛，就是压抑其实就是一种升华。弗洛伊德就是他中间一步的第二步的思想嘛，就是压抑是一种升华，所以这个压抑就是说它不只是一个症状，或者说如果说这个压抑带来了那种主体的症状那种神经症，那么这个神经症也有其这个崇高的一面，就是升华，对吧？就是类似，其实压抑就是升华这个东西，在这个某种资本主义，就是这也是像因为资本主义这种对象化的操作嘛，也是某种常见的这个思潮，就类似说就这个压抑就是某一种升华，就类似人类文明也需要这种压抑了，就是需要这种俄狄浦斯什么什么之类的，需要适当的压抑。然后到晚期的时候，他越琢磨这味儿越不对，他就写了这个超越快乐原则，越写越琢磨觉得这个味儿又不对，然后又写超越快乐原则，就说啊这个压抑跟这个升华也是那个他的胡说八道的，似乎主体也并不是这样的。
Lecture 2 was a kind of
因为他发现有时候又发现升华就是对主体最大的这个戕害，就是那个死亡驱力。
A direct follow-up to Lecture 1, and hence why I'm including it here, in that it's introducing the main topics of the seminar. It was also one of the more difficult lectures to follow. Perhaps this is in part because the audience was responding to Coirier's lecture on Plato's dialogue, the Meno, the previous night. This led into a conversation about whether the Meno displays a logic consistent with psychoanalysis. Maimonides suggests that they are different because, in part, whereas Maieudics, the Socratic teaching, brings to light a forgotten truth, which is in fact eternal, analysis brings to light historical truth of the subject, and this truth is discovered in error, and error is seen in truth. Lacan is not completely pleased with Maimonides' assessment, though it's not clear that he directly addresses Maimonides' comments, something that seems to be picked up by Hippolyte, who is also in the audience. Lacan appears to be interested in the relation of knowledge and a truth that is ungraspable by such knowledge. This is relevant to the Meno because the initial question raised by Meno to Socrates.
你们到底知不知道他说米诺篇就美浓篇到底是什么？就是形而上学那些东西，就是刚才前不是有人有提到关于回忆的问题吗？这个就是关于回忆的问题，就是这一期拉康就在讨论这个回忆的问题，但是这个回忆不是你们想的那种 memories， 它是关于知识跟真理的问题。因为根据这个美诺篇，就米诺篇或什么的，其实就是柏拉图所说的这个所有的知识都来源于一种回忆嘛，就是形而上学啊。就你所有的知识它都是有原型的，然后你在这一世只是获得一些前世的回忆而已。那么在另一个完美的理想的世界里面
concerns the nature of virtue. Socrates ultimately demonstrates that excellence is not taught and so is not a kind of knowledge. Knowledge is the intuition of the eternal forms through reminiscence, which Lacan locates in the imaginary plane, along with, interestingly enough, a priori intuitions. However, there's also the eruption, or a kind of forcing in which the symbolic emerges, and in so doing, creates its own past. I think this is in reference to retroaction, and Lacan was speaking of something similar in the previous lecture, Lecture 1, when it came to the introduction of a new concept, such as the philosophical ego, which, once it appears, is retroactively seen as a concept that precedes its emergence. Where it is retroactively seen as a concept that precedes its emergence. Whereas retroaction is an expression of symbolic time, the forgetting of the symbolic intervention and belief that something was there all along is a form of imaginary time. It's a forgetting of the creative function of truth in its nascent form, and it's what introduces error into knowledge. So one might ask where the ego is in Plato, for example. This would be sort of an anachronistic question, but one that happens frequently. All this reminds me a little bit of the situation in which an outcome seems predictable only after it happens. In social psychology, this is called the I knew it all along phenomenon. Or in sports, it might be called Monday morning quarterbacking. And just before recording this, I came across this meme, which I think aptly captures well not only how the ego, represented by the visitor center, emerges in relation to trauma, the asteroid impact, but also its sense of time and considering itself as having preceded itself. Lecture 2 concludes with an analysis of beyond the pleasure principle. There are some interesting points worth mentioning. He identifies two ambiguities in the text. First, the compulsion to repeat seems to institute a kind of human progress by leading one to go beyond the limits of the pleasure principle, but it also has a regressive function, stagnating progress and operating as a pure automatism. Second, the ego is sometimes presented as an instinct for self-preservation and at other times a pursuit for death. Lacan mostly praises this analysis and goes on to say that no other text so profoundly questions the meaning of life as does Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Lacan will address these ambiguities as we proceed through Seminar 2. And with that, we will end today's video. The next video will examine Lecture 3 entitled The Symbolic Universe. Thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.
OK， 我们今天就学到这里吧，意犹未尽，也没有未尽啦，就是他讲了一大堆东西嘛。他其实就是对那些，这里基本上就是，拉康对那些常见的一些庸俗的、庸见的，就也是在跟人家抬杠。就是那些杠精，他就抬一抬那个常见的庸俗的看法，包括我们说那些什么自我之类的，就笛卡尔式的自我。这一期他不是也讲了吗？就是说拉康讲的东西为什么很难，因为他都是那种分析师的讲法，就是他当你回答这个问题，当他回答你的问题的时候，他就会在幻想，在自己的这个剧场中再幻想出一个分析师，然后再次回答这个问题，所以他所有的东西都比较难理解，都是这样子的。比如说他在抬杠，就是那些人就讨论关于什么笛卡尔式的什么什么自我之类的，自我他不是不想讲好，就是他没办法讲。比如说讨论自我的问题，比如说有时候我给你们讲什么东西，我有时候为什么会说话说得很慢，就也是一样，我讲一讲就会后撤。就比如说我跟你们讲什么东西，然后我意识到自己开始口胡了，就是我自己讲很爽，对不对？当我意识到这个自己开始口胡，自己开始讲很爽的时候，我就会停下来，然后我就在想，就是这个问题我为什么跟你这么说，是因为什么？是因为什么？我为什么要这样跟你回答这个问题，不那样回答你这个问题？你就会开始躲避那个快感，然后你就会再重新换一个形式来回答这个事情，就是你不太会去直接的回答这个问题了。就比如说刚才我说那个什么什么笛卡尔什么什么之类的问题，他一会儿也会说嘛，说这个笛卡尔式的自我问题什么，他现在回答这个问题想说不，他开始重新讨论时间性的问题，就是这里你们能理解，其实可以说那个回溯性的时间性到底是什么东西吧。其实就弗洛伊德那一句，就本我在哪里，自我就在那里生成，这是我的责任，或者是无意识在哪里，意识在哪里生成，这是我的责任，就是都是回溯性的。就是你这种一致性的线性的幻想就是通过什么串起来的，不是通过理性串起来，是通过创伤串起来的，就类似就这种东西。然后他的意思是通过时间创伤，然后获得这种就是在想象的时间中这种一致性的自我的体验，这个东西就是回溯性时间性。然后包括最后他就说那个东西叫什么，就是超越快乐原则。其实超越快乐原则我当时看之后我也有点震惊，我也开始对这个问题感到震惊。就每次我看到这些弗洛伊德的书，我也觉得真的是了不起。但是应该怎么说呢，他的书说实话你看上去如果不通过解读是没有那么精彩的，因为他一大半都在口胡，就是在完全胡说八道，彻彻底底胡说八道。就比如说超越快乐原则，他就会讨论什么什么神经有某种承受激素的上限的阈值，然后神经有某种如何应对这些比如说什么快感的冲动的，然后它是什么先有个什么来的什么快感，然后有个负向的冲压的快感，然后这两个快感通过什么某种什么神经性的什么调和什么， 全是这种东西，就是全是全是在胡说八道。因为拉康是找到这个关键了嘛，就是它是关于能指的。对，但是弗洛伊德找不到啊，他就只能找那个生物学上的、生理学上的。生物学就说啊，生物学上因为这个神经它怎么样啊，就开始就可能纯口胡，但是他又能敏锐的发现这个现象，有这个反思力，但他又找不到原因，就纯口胡就可能。等我调一下这个摄像头，来跟大家聊一下这个超越快乐原则。我给你们看一看，你们自己真的是也不下一本书，我给你们瞅一瞅弗洛伊德这书里面都在写什么。反正就一边看一边笑，太逗乐了。我每次看他到底知不知道自己在说什么。比如说我们来看这个性学三论，接受刺激的皮层并不具备过滤来自内部兴奋刺激的保护层，然后这段全是他纯口胡的，因为这个什么保护层是什么不知道，保护层是什么，然后什么内部兴奋刺激也不知道是什么，这就使那些来自内部的兴奋刺激的传导方面具备了现实意义上的至关重要的优势。这种传导优势还时常引发就简单来说，我觉得比拉康还难懂。某些与创伤性神经症相仿的现实障碍，这种内部的兴奋最丰富的源泉就是有机体的本能及所有从身体内部萌发继而传送到心理器官的力量，在心理学研究中这个好像是超越快乐原则吧，纯口胡，真是民科，纯口胡。曾决定着古老生物命运的这种存在是远远超出个体生命的本能，为原始有机体提供保护伞，以此来抵御他们之前无法应对外部刺激的这种本能，指引着生殖细胞之间相对这种本能。像这样的所有本能通称为性本能群什么什么，但是显然他们竭尽全力是两个异性生殖细胞融为一体，倘若融合失败，它们将与多细胞有机体内其他物质同归于尽。性的功能只有通过这种融合才能让细胞的生命得以延续，从而至少在形式上是永生的。反正就纯在胡说八道，我就这么跟你说好了，纯在胡说八道。但是事实上，弗洛伊德的天才之处在于，他能把那种日常压抑过的那些就是无意识的欲望很好的捕捉出来。就比如说我们说这个超越快乐原则这个东西，其实简单来理解什么，就是主体自己给自己找罪受嘛，对吧？主体自己给自己找罪受，就是说咋歪打正着呢？靠临床，也不是歪打正着，也不是临床，就是他比较诚实。就是比如说我们说这个自己给自己找罪受，它会变成症状嘛，症状就 PTSD 嘛。PTSD， 比如说老有人说什么在那个什么在失恋的痛苦里面走不出来嘛，就是其实你只要对这些现象抱有问题意识，你能提出正确的问题嘛，你就会想说为什么？就是因为我们想想看，比如当我们假设主体是理性的。是什么趋利避害的，追求快乐的，那你就会问这些问题啊，那你为什么失恋了走不出来？那你不是应该很快就能走出来吗？或者是那失恋了为什么会痛苦呢？或者是为什么会发展成一种症状，就是不停的就是这种主体是什么机制，为什么会失灵呢？你就问这些问题就好了。他就是看到，因为他做临床，他知道这些人的问题嘛，然后我的意思只要你在这些问题够诚实就行。但是他又能把，就是他隐隐约约后来就发现原来这一切就是说主体知道这个问题，只不过是他以某种方式然后阻碍了，所以他就开始提出各种什么 regression 什么阻抗什么什么之类的，对，然后无意识，然后或者说他会发现啊，这个阻抗其实是一种愿望的满足什么的，他这个阻抗是愿望的满足，这个东西其实也是正确的。